Keir Starmer's government could be receiving intelligence from Israel that was obtained under torture. That's a concern being raised by human rights groups, who Declassified has spoken to exclusively for our latest article that was written by myself and my colleague Hamza Yusuf, who's joining me now to talk about the story. Great to have you with us, Hamza.
Pleasure.
Hamza, this article that we've put out today, I think, is raising fresh concerns about the ramifications of Israel's widespread torture of detainees, which is being acknowledged by more and more, not just NGOs and UN bodies, but the UK government itself has acknowledged it last week. That if you have an ally who is using torture to extract intelligence about where hostages might be, and you then share that intelligence with the Royal Air Force, who are flying these daily surveillance flights over Gaza looking for those hostages, uh, is that not just unethical, but also potentially illegal and in breach of the UK government's obligations under domestic and international law not to use intelligence that's come from torture? I should say we put these questions to the UK Ministry of Defence about whether Israel had shared that kind of intelligence with them, and they didn't engage at all with our questions. This seems like an issue that more and more people need to start asking the government questions about, particularly in light of these testimonies that we saw and that some of which you gathered yourself, Hamza, about the shocking abuse of Palestinian prisoners by Israel, and also the specific kinds of questions that they're being asked during interrogation. Could you tell us a little bit about that side of the story?
Torture and mistreatment of Palestinians in kind of grim Israeli prisons has long been a feature of kind of the multi-pronged systematic Israeli oppression of Palestinians, but it's definitely been turbocharged post October 7th. We saw the testimonies of um, Palestinian medical workers or just medical workers in Gaza, and they were harrowing. They painted a really devastating picture: people being beaten, stripped naked, handcuffed, being left in the middle of the night, naked all night, being denied sufficient sleep, food, and water. There was one particular Palestinian civilian who noted he was asked for a drink, and Israeli soldier, urinated in his mouth. So the testimonies paint a really grim picture. Um, and when you consider this has been widely reported, it's been touched on by Human Rights Watch. This is corroborated by, we had American physicians and doctors who were in Gaza who wrote to President Biden, Kamala Harris, saying there are really bad conditions, really grim conditions in these Israeli prison camps, and the extent of the torture interrogation that takes place. And this just adds to that. And it's worth pointing out regarding these testimonies that that were conducted by lawyers, campaigners, etc. that we saw. None of these were, everybody was spoken in an individual case, right? So nobody was aware of what the other person was saying or that anybody else had been spoken to, and yet the same patterns emerge. Really sadistic, really savagery levels of abuse and assault. And yeah, we spoke to a Palestinian lawyer who was subjected to really brutal beatings and really grim account that he painted. And he mentioned it was the hardest torture he'd endured physically and psychologically. He mentions dogs being unleashed, being taken to rooms where soldiers are beating them and then encouraging other soldiers to join in.
The Palestinian lawyer who you spoke to, Hamza, he'd been released from Israeli custody after over 7 months, which had seen him held in various sites, including the notorious said Timon camp, which is where Israeli forces have been allegedly sodomizing detainees as well. And Israeli police actually went in to try and arrest some of the guards there. And then there was this kind of riots backed by Israel's far right to kind of try and prevent those people being prosecuted or arrested even. So this is kind of the testimony that's coming out. There have been Israeli soldiers who've leaked to groups like Breaking the Silence. CNN have reported on this as well. And what we saw last week when David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary, announced that some arms export licenses would be suspended to Israel, one of the three main reasons he gave were concerns about the mistreatment of detainees. Let's just listen to what he said in Parliament.
This government is also deeply concerned by credible claims of mistreatment of detainees. which the International Committee of the Red Cross cannot investigate after being denied access to places of detention. Both my predecessor and all our major allies have repeatedly and forcefully raised these concerns with the Israeli government. Regrettably, they have not been addressed satisfactorily.
Lamy has effectively acknowledged there, I mean, he's put it in very mild terms, but that this mistreatment at the very least is going on. I mean, it's torture, it's not just mistreatment. But the ramifications of that for the arms export case, which was due in court the next day, was that Israel might be targeting airstrikes based on intelligence derived through torture. We spoke to the lawyers at the heart of that case. They represent the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq, and they themselves come from an organization called the Global Legal Action Network. And what they told us was, well, yes, this could also pose concerns for the RAF surveillance flights over Gaza. How can they be sure that Israel isn't giving them intelligence that's come from torture in order to better guide where those planes look? They spend about 5 hours at a time flying over different parts of Gaza with all sorts of eavesdropping and video and infrared equipment, supposedly looking for where the hostages are held. And they pointed us to the testimonies that they'd gathered for that arms case court and had been filed at the High Court. They'd been seen by UK government lawyers. And in two of them specifically, the detainees, who were both Palestinian medics, who were tortured horrifically, as you've just described, Hamza, they were specifically asked, where are the hostages being held? Where are the tunnels? So while this is clearly, in large part a sadistic, activity, Israeli soldiers trying to just wreak revenge for October 7th, there is also an element of intelligence gathering in there. And this should pose serious questions for the UK about their intelligence sharing relationship with Israel, which is largely shrouded in secrecy. But we did have some insight into it when Colonel Richard Kemp, who is a notoriously pro-Israel British Army veteran, gave this testimony to a parliamentary committee in April.
It's been a number of years since I worked for the Joint Intelligence Committee. But in my capacity there, I was well aware of very, very close intelligence relationships between Israel and the United Kingdom, from which the UK and Israel both benefited. From my knowledge of the way that the Israeli government and the Israeli intelligence services operate, I think even if there was a real breakdown in relations between Britain and the UK, it's highly unlikely that Israel would cut off intelligence sharing with the UK.
Hamza, what do you make of this intelligence sharing relationship between the UK and Israel? Because I know that on the one side, you actually have Israel lobby groups now saying, well, if the UK isn't going to export arms to us, Israel might stop intelligence sharing. But actually, one of the reasons why the UK decided to stop selling some arms to Israel is because of concerns about torture, which should also have implications for the intelligence sharing relationship, right?
Yeah, and like you said, it's very much taboo. It's very, very much shrouded in secrecy. But it's interesting. There was an article penned just this week by Joanne Ryan, former Labour MP, former Labour Friends of Israel chair, and she noted that Mossad, obviously Israel's intelligence agency, is the second largest partner with Britain when it comes to intelligence sharing. So now they're kind of saying it out loud, and they said it's important that we maintain these relationships. The New York Times touched on this in the summer, following it was called a hostage rescue operation, but 300 Palestinians were massacred in the process. This was back in the summer, and they said that Israel is getting better at locating where hostages are based or located, and one of the fundamental ways in which they're able to obtain this information is via the interrogation, or via the speaking to detainees or extracting information from them, and which we've obviously touched upon some of the methods. And then specifically, the New York Times article noted that this is in part with the assistance of Britain and America, in terms of it's an all-encompassing relationship, right? So it does pose ethical questions regarding the depth of this relationship, which we do now know exists. We do now know it exists, as it is now being openly spoken about, whereas previously that wasn't the case.
Many people are understandably hugely concerned about the conditions the hostages are being held in Gaza. And one of the remaining hostages is understood to be a British national. And the UK government clearly feels it has an obligation to help rescue that hostage. And that's been the justification, really, for why these surveillance flights started flying over Gaza in December. And there have been hundreds of them since. Now, one of the issues is that with supporting a military approach to rescuing the hostages is that actually far more hostages have been freed through the ceasefire negotiations in November last year than the IDF have managed to rescue through military operations. And in those military operations, there have been not just Israeli hostages themselves who've been killed, but also hundreds of Palestinian civilians too. And there's even allegations that one of the British hostages, Nadav Popplewell, was actually killed in an Israeli airstrike. So, I mean, there are lots of reasons to be concerned about why Britain, by continuing to fly these surveillance flights to look for hostages, is supporting a military approach to the conflict, which has been shown over the last 11 months to yield very little results. And also, there are specific issues now in terms of the UK's obligations not to be complicit in torture that could be in real risk of being breached with this admission that Israel is mistreating detainees. This comes out of the extraordinary rendition scandal after 9/11, which saw MI5 and MI6 receiving foreign intelligence from detainees who've been abused. This was all part of the CIA's global torture program. And as a result of that scandal, new rules were published by David Cameron and updated by other prime ministers since. They're now known as the Principles on the Receipt of Intelligence from Detainees. And this basically sets out this scenario where if a foreign intelligence agency is giving you info that you think might have come from a detainee who's been tortured, you need to inform ministers, you need to tell the foreign agency that receiving this intelligence doesn't mean you condone their methods. There's basically a whole process that Whitehall's meant to go through and ultimately stop receiving that information if they really think it has come from torture. And we've been asking questions to the MOD about this. How are they following this process? How is it being engaged in respect of RAF operations over Gaza? And they've just completely avoided those questions. They've given us a kind of generic non-answer, saying that their priority is for a ceasefire. So it looks like they have something to hide there. And, at the very least, this is something that more MPs now really need to start asking questions about. If you're watching this video and you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please press the button below. You can also help Declassified do more investigations like this by donating to our work via the Super Thanks button or by joining Declassified from £3 a month. Thanks for watching.